Ever since I first learned of the efforts and successes of other cities around the world towards making their citizens less reliant upon personal automobiles for transportation, I've wondered why Phoenix didn't make similar efforts. The particular issue is of significance to me because of the limitations I dealt with when I was younger. I did not have my own car because such a luxury was outside of my family's means. In fact, I didn't even get around to getting my driver's license until I was almost 21. After all, without a car, what good is a license? To this day, every time I experience car troubles or simply don't feel like dealing with traffic because it's a huge pain, I wish that I had another way to get where I was going. Here in Phoenix, if I want to get most places, I have to drive myself or I just change my mind and stay home. When I first started looking into this issue, I read up on other places in the world, Bogota and Copenhagen, to name a couple. Based primarily on my interviews, I discovered that there are other people in Greater Phoenix area who also wished transportation was more readily available outside of just hopping in their car and driving there themselves. Some people completely don't enjoy driving. Some wish they could save money. Others are concerned about the environmental and economic impact of driving a car everywhere, all the time, every day. However, with only one exception, everyone I spoke to avoided alternate modes of transportation because they perceived them in an unfavorable light. The exception to this was a woman who had regularly biked to work in the past, but when she moved outside of a reasonable biking range of bus stops and light rail stops, she had no choice but to stop. The perceptions of the others were what one might expect. They thought it was for poor people, that bus stops were always dirty, buses were always dirty, it's an inefficient way to get where you're going, it's not a safe way to get where you're going, and the list could go on and on. As I spoke to more people and reflected upon my own perceptions of these alternatives, I realized there was a correlation. Citizens view alternative modes of transportation in an unfavorable light, largely because of the limited infrastructure the greater Phoenix area has in place. When I read up on the new light rail system and realized that with its great infrastructure in place, it had actually proved way more successful than they'd anticipated, I realized that I was on the right track with this. Since this project was so heavily based on personal perception and opinions, much of my data was collected through interviewing various people from a variety of situations in their lives, as well as with varying backgrounds. In addition, I asked each of these subjects willing to be interviewed if they would take a hands-on approach to data collection in hopes that they might change their perception or at least give me insight into what they saw as an issue once they actually tried these different ways of getting around. With limited time available in the budget for this part of the research and the threat of summer heat looming over us, many of the subjects were completely unwilling to even consider doing some hands-on experimentation. In the end, I had a grand total of 3 participants in this part of the experiment, which included myself. The willing subjects were all asked to avoid using their car for any errands, engagements they had planned, going to work, etc. for an entire week, starting on a Monday and ending on Sunday. For the week prior to that, I asked that each of them keep a log of their travel times so I could compare it to their travel times when they were using alternate modes of transportation. I also asked that they keep a journal or some sort of notebook detailing the experiences they had, what they liked about the experience, what they didn't like about the experience, and any thoughts they had about how the experience could be improved for anyone doing the same thing. Since this was my project, and I'm certainly reliant upon my car on a daily basis, it was only fair that I also take part in this portion of the experiment and collect my own data. For my own part in this experiment, I found the experience was nowhere near as bad as I'd expected. That was a consensus with my other 2 subjects as well. The issues generally experienced by each of us were either infrequent, such as the time I saw a vagrant on the bus whose pants refused to stay on, which I'm glad to say nobody else had that experience and I only had to deal with it the one ride, or the issues were related primarily to infrastructure. What few bike lanes we have access to are narrow and are separated from traffic by nothing more than a painted stripe only a few inches across. We have no divides like Copenhagen has, and in many instances the bike lanes were treated as part of the right lane for cars, or they were used as parking spaces. Many other bikers didn't even seem to be using the bike lanes when they were available. Instead, they opted to use the sidewalk, which felt safer and more secure. To be completely honest, I did the same myself on several situations. The bus stops were poorly designed for Arizona. They featured small overhangs for shade at best, which would help for maybe half the day. And one of my bus stops didn't even have that. Instead, it just had a tall, pathetic palm tree on its north side, which offered absolutely no shade. The buses themselves were rarely dirty beyond reason, and they certainly weren't as crowded as one would expect based on what stereotypes suggest. The bus schedule was an issue in 3 cases. Once, for myself, where the bus left the stop early and I wound up being 30 minutes behind schedule afterwards. And the other 2 experiences were actually for the other 2 subjects. One had a late bus, which was only a few minutes, and the other one, their bus got held up at a stop and they ended up being late where they were going. All in all, one abnormal or unpleasant experience with another rider out of a sample population of 22 bus trips is less than 5% bad experiences, which is pretty good. The 3 issues of timing, of course, were about 15% of the bus trip population. The results of the time differences in the subjects' travel was fairly uniform. The travel time for each of them roughly doubled. This could be an acceptable loss of time, especially if you're using your bus trip to work on something on your laptop or read, or if you consider the exercise you're getting while walking or biking instead of driving. In that case, you could even skip going to the gym that night. In the end, each of my subjects agreed that the experience of alternate transportation wouldn't be so bad for them if the bike lanes weren't so inadequate and if the bus stops weren't so uncomfortable. This strongly supports my hypothesis that poor infrastructure is causing people to have a negative view of these alternatives to driving. A good follow-up would be to incorporate more subjects and have more of them actually be willing to test this alternative transportation. In a follow-up experiment, it would also be beneficial to categorize the travel time by buses, light rail, walking, or biking, just to get an idea or a feel for what the differences each mode gave to that person experiencing it. Once enough data has been collected to convince naysayers of the benefits of building up infrastructure, I think it would be helpful to also research ways other places have designed their infrastructure to support positive perception of alternate transportation modes.